Starting in the early 2000s, a series of articles began popping up in major publications: the Washington Post, the Daily Herald, Harvard Business Review, and more. Each of these articles called out the primary failure of business schools around the country. That failure? Ethics classes. Yeah, ethics classes. More specifically, the authors shared their dismay that ethics were isolated from the core learning. Instead, they argued ethics should be woven into the fabric of business across all areas of the curriculum. Ethics can't be cordoned off from the rest of a business student's education, one critic argued. The fundamental problem with partitioning off ethics and values is that students will think about self-serving bias and discrimination and moral disengagement only so long as it's the focus of classroom conversation, then forget it amid discussions of marketing, finance, and accounting. I've held on to this idea that the presence of ethics classes demonstrates an ethical failing ever since. Now, I see a parallel in Jewish education and practice. What you ask might represent Judaism's version of the isolated ethics class. It's a book, first published in 1981 by Rabbi Alfred J. Kolach. That book, The Jewish Book of Why. If we need a Jewish book of why, then clearly we're not teaching it. Let's read the first two sentences. Over the years, many books describing Jewish life, its laws, its customs, its ceremonies have appeared. Practically all are devoted to a recitation of rules of conduct, but few, if any, devote themselves to any explanation of why specific laws, customs, and ceremonies have evolved. As Rabbi Kolach identifies, generations of Jews have learned the what without the why. We've learned the practice without the purpose, the action without the context. Rabbi Kolach continues, to understand the why, it is important first to understand the how, the when, and the where. As Jews, how do we share that how, the when, and the where? We do it by telling stories. Put another way, to give Judaism meaning, we need to tell our stories. Last Thursday afternoon, we gathered at East Cobb Park for Tashlich to offer a few prayers and to throw bread into a river. That's the what. But why? How did bread, this symbol of nourishment and home and family, come to represent the casting off of our sins? We do not invest our sins into our bread, unlike a popular mid-late 90s sermon suggests. The bread we throw does not represent sins we committed. If we committed arson, we can't throw toast. So why bread? Here's the story. In the Middle Ages, when the Tashlich ritual arose, our ancestors would often carry their lunch in their pockets. These lunches often included hunks of bread. Over time, their pockets would fill with crumbs. Rosh Hashanah invites us to reflect on ourselves and our actions, to turn out our spiritual pockets, let go of our burdens, physical, emotional, and more, that we carry around. What did our ancestors find when they turned out their pockets? Crumbs. Breadcrumbs. These crumbs became the symbols of everything we release at Tashlich. That's why we throw bread. That's the story. That's the why. And that's what's missing from too much of what we do. Everyone who joined last year's Talmud Tuesdays class knows how much I adore Talmud. Talmud at its core is a collection of rabbinic stories and discussions passed down from one generation of rabbis to another, compiled sometime around 600 CE. In one well-known story, in Tractate Kiddushin, a group of rabbis lounge in a home in the town of Lod. One rabbi asks a question, which is greater, study or action? Rabbi Tarfon responds first. He answers, action is greater. Rabbi Akiva answers next, study is greater. This group of ancient rabbis concludes, study is greater because study leads to action. Today, in our limited time and space for Jewish education, we unconsciously debate which is greater, custom or story. And today I declare stories are greater because stories motivate engagement. Stories are necessary because they offer an avenue for investment of belief. Our values have more meaning when they're attached to our stories. Stories motivate. They offer a sense of purpose, of belonging. Stories help us transcend mere expectation or duty and rise to the level of obligation. For those that are inspired, the motivation to act is deeply personal. Rabbi Nancy Weiner, a professor of pastoral care and counseling at Hebrew Union College in New York, agrees. She wrote, "Anyone can be kind to a stranger, but it's far more powerful to have a story that reminds us that we were strangers and then slaves in Egypt. A story that demonstrates that when we are kind to strangers, it's because we remember who we are and where we've been. Only then will we understand kindness to strangers as a fundamental part of our identity. Everyone can enjoy rest, a break from work. But when we rest because we remember that we are a part of creation and that rest is a holy act, we approach it in a different spirit, a spirit that reinforces our sense of belonging to a larger whole. Judaism must give us more than a simple course of action. It must also offer us a cause for action. Laws demand obedience, stories, good stories. And Judaism has so many good stories. Those good stories inspire meaningful action. Let's tell another story, one from the Hasidic tradition. When Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov, master of the good name, saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of a certain forest to pray. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would occur, misfortune averted. Later, when his student, the celebrated Maggid of Metzrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place, the same forest, and say, "Master of the universe, listen. I do not know how to light the fire, but I'm still able to say the prayer." He would say the prayer, and again the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be enough." It was enough, and the miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Ritzin to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. "I'm unable to light the fire, and I don't know the prayer. Cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and that must be enough." And it was enough. In some ways, it's a lovely story. In others, hugely problematic. One might ask, why suggest that each generation fails more than the previous one? Why didn't the Hasidic masters ensure that their students knew these world-saving prayers, locations, and techniques? Why didn't the students ask? Why did the disciples resign themselves to being unable to carry on or build on their teachers' traditions? Contrary to this story, perhaps just the story is not enough after all. In the 1970s, media theorist Marshall McLuhan coined the idea, "the medium is the message." The medium is the message. In doing so, he rightly identified that the means of communication itself creates an impact, regardless of what is being said, instead of the commonly accepted attitude that the content of a message is more important than its form. When we teach Judaism and Jewish practice, the medium we choose matters as much as the message we hope to share. When we teach the what without the why, the product is dry and stale. It's flat. When we teach the why without the what, the product is ephemeral. It doesn't last. But when we tell the stories, when we teach the why along with the what, we offer breadth, we offer depth, we excite emotion, we enable exploration, we kindle curiosity, we inspire investment. So now, I share a new version of that Baal Shem Tov story, published by an unnamed author of a now-defunct blog. The author shares their frustrations with the original and offers their own version of the story, their idealized version, one that depicts a thicker Judaism than what we want to see. At times of great crisis, the Baal Shem Tov would go to a special place in the middle of a forest, beseech God to avert the danger, and the crisis would be averted. After the Baal Shem Tov passed, his student, the Maggid of Metzrich, would, at times of great crisis, go to the same place in the forest. He composed a special prayer that he would utter each time such action was needed, and the crisis would be averted. After the Maggid passed on, his student Moshe Leb of Sasov would, at times of great crisis, go to the same special place in the forest. He would recite the Maggid of Metrich's prayer, adding a special prayer from his own heart. He would also light a fire to ensure that any wandering travelers would be able to find him, along with light, warmth, and sustenance, and the crisis would be averted. After Moshe Leb passed on, his student, Israel of Ritzin, would bring his students to the same special place in the forest. He would teach them the Maggid of Metzrich's prayer and encourage them to add a prayer of their own. He would show them how to light the same guiding fire that Moshe Leb lit, and they would sit by the fire and learn the story of the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Metzrich, and Moshe Leb of Sasov. And the Holy Blessed One would rejoice. This year, may we tell more stories, and together may we rejoice. Gemar Chatima Tova.